All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator or specialist with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. One of the things I do is I reach out a lot to teach people about different invasive species, particularly those that intersect our urban forestry and other hardwood areas in Indiana. Before I got here, some of you may have seen programs I gave as an extension educator where I served Clay and Owen County for a few years. Tonight, I normally talk about insects, but this evening we are going to be talking about Asian bush honeysuckle. And the reason that I chose this particular offender right here is that I live in Terre Haute, Indiana. A lot of you on here do as well, I know. And one of the things that we always see in Terre Haute is right around this time of year, if there is anything green in the forest understory, this is a tree city, if there is anything green, it is Asian bush honeysuckle. Almost without fail. I mean, there may be some multiflora rose, and at a later date, we'll talk about that. But honestly, the lion's share of the green plants right now are probably this particularly nasty invasive. So my goal tonight is first, I like to use this particular program as a way of kind of setting the stage for explaining what is an actual invasive species and why we are concerned about them and how they operate, and then dive into methods of trying to control this plant. I am using a lot of information that was provided by SICM, the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management. And I got to give credit to them for their hard work and a lot of the stuff you're going to see this evening. And I have some pictures on here. I haven't been able to properly credit them yet because I haven't found the person who took them. If you see them and you know who took them, please let me know so I can make sure I can get credit to them. All right, so diving right in. Asian bush honeysuckle is actually a group of species that are prevalent throughout the United States. They all share pretty much very similar characteristics. They're a bushy species. They're very, very tough, very, very resilient, and they can be a major problem whether you are in an urban environment or if you are in a state park. I use state parks as an example because I spent some time helping out McCormick's Creek and other state parks look at their Asian bush honeysuckle problems. And folks, the honeysuckle there grew so thick the deer couldn't even get through it. It was like a wall of just plants. And it was so challenging for them to eliminate. I'm happy I was able to help at least a little. Now, there are a lot of plants that can have a similar appearance to honeysuckle, and we're going to go over some of the identifying characteristics of this plant just in brief, though usually it's pretty easy to identify once you get the hang of it. Now, first off, getting started with this evening, the biggest thing that I always like to do, like I said, is I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page as for what is an invasive species. And right here, this is an invasive species you're looking at right now that a lot of people will argue because this is one that's commonly planted as an ornamental. It's called Callery pear or Bradford pear. It's a very popular plant, but unfortunately, it's also very invasive and it will not stay where you plant it. It will spread. Right now in Terre Haute, if I were to drive out, say, towards the town of Riley, I will see Callery pear beginning to invade new areas out in the middle of nowhere where no one intentionally planted it. It just got spread that way through its seed. So to answer this question, getting rolling, what is an invasive species? First off, it is a plant or animal. And I actually need to revise this. It is an organism, because not all of these are plants or animals, that is present in an environment other than its native range. Now, this means that when it is outside of its native range, there are no herbivores, no predators, and no diseases that have evolved with them to control the population of this organism. The predators won't recognize it as food. Herbivores may not be able to work past the plant's defenses, and diseases may not have adapted ways to be able to get into them. There's also, this means essentially that there are no biocontrol agents. There are no bugs that are going to chew on them. There are no fungal diseases that will rot them out in bad conditions. If you have a situation like this, this means that an invader who basically has a significantly reduced rate of attrition is going to outcompete the native species that do have herbivores or predators or diseases that can strike them. That's not a great situation if you're trying to maintain an ecosystem, whether it's an ecosystem comprised of the landscaping on your home property, or if you're trying to manage like a state park or a hardwood forest. None of these are good things to see when you're working with this. Now, the worst thing about invasive species is that essentially every single one of them is introduced by us. We introduce them through our activity. Anymore, I would say primarily it comes through because of shipping activities. We are only still learning how to identify invaders that are coming shipped in plants and soil, on rock, etc., as they enter our country. However, we have a very healthy amount of invasive species that are intentionally planted because we think they're pretty. And you will find that the world over with a lot of different species, including winged burning bush, Callery, pear, and even more. The general effect of this is that you are looking at the local biodiversity being impacted, sometimes often very severely reduced, because the invader has no competition. They take over the landscape, and since they're the only thing that's successful in growing, you lose biodiversity, you lose species out of it, which means you also lose what's called an ecosystem service, where different organisms can provide a benefit to human activity by helping protect our gardens or helping our trees grow healthier. We lose those services because now we're looking at a monoculture of just one species. This can cause severe crop damage. It can cause, and I've seen it cause, untold damage to pasture or open ground. And ultimately, it will devalue land as well if you're worried about your pocketbook. Now, what does this competition look like and how do they get started with it? Well, this image you're seeing right now is a really great example of it. For those, some of you may recognize this off the bat, but this is kudzu, and this was definitely intentionally introduced by us. The picture you're looking at right now, I believe this is one of mine actually that I took in Mississippi. The kudzu there was covering literally everything. What you're looking at here is me, I believe I am aimed at a pole that was broken in half during a storm. You would see kudzu crawl up telephone poles, that would crawl over buildings, it would crawl over trees, it would just cover everything. That was its way of outcompeting the other species around it because it would vine and crawl over them, and that way they were getting the lion's share of the sunlight. That was a good strategy by that plant, but a terrible thing if you're worried about an invader. So moving on, this is another one that I got to see quite a bit when I was a graduate student. I knew another student who studied this quite a bit. Japanese stiltgrass, we have this in Indiana. And again, this is another example of a plant that competes very, very well. Because what you're seeing here is, say you're looking at this and you're looking at the forest floor. And right now you are seeing just these little blades of leaves off the stiltgrass. But what you're not seeing underneath the soil is that each of these stiltgrass sprouts coming out of the ground are connected by a runner. And that runner can be very, very large and widespread. It's entirely possible to see several acres worth of stiltgrass and it be one single organism because they're all connected by a runner. So if you're trying to clear that out, let's say you chop it up, you're trying to disconnect it, the plant doesn't need to stay completely connected to all of the other portions of itself to survive. That is a really, really terrible invader that you're trying to work with there. And it's very, very hard to kill. And there's still research going on trying to figure out ways to get rid of stiltgrass and kudzu and a lot of other species. Now, I mentioned this word earlier, biodiversity. Now, I know that a lot of folks have probably heard this term before as kind of a buzzword, and you think it's probably a great term, you know, it means more life, right? What it's ultimately going to come down to meaning is how many species and how many unique ecological roles are those species filling up? Because the more roles that are getting filled in an ecosystem by more and different kinds of species, that's good. That means we're getting those ecosystem services. That means that our ecosystems become resilient because let's say we lose a species. Well, if we're good and biodiverse, we have other species that can then step into that role. And the ecosystem is now resilient. It can bend under pressure. We don't want it to break though. And the fewer species we have in that, the more it shows a tendency to break. There are actually a lot of ecologists who will often refer to an ecosystem as being its own kind of organism in and of itself, with all the species acting as the biomechanical machinery or the individual organs of that ecosystem, and a really interesting concept. It's not a very clean one, but it does work. So if we keep looking at this a little bit here, you've probably heard this term before. nature abhors a monoculture. And we see this very much in crop fields. Crop fields are a great representation of where monocultures are not good for a diverse ecosystem. So we see that there are only a few different kinds of plants and animals that will grow in them. They tend to be less resilient. So if suddenly weeds start developing in your cornfield, it can do a lot of damage to your corn. Or if you suddenly get a particular insect pest that's not going away, say you're growing corn, you get Western corn rootworm, that can really devastate your corn crop. Now, the thing is if you're talking about an ag field, though, you need a monoculture. You're not supposed to be diverse. You need those plants to be plant singly. However, outside of that situation, if we're talking about inside of a forest, that's not a great situation. If you have a forest that's entirely made of pine and you suddenly get pine bark beetle, you don't have any other trees that are going to survive the pine bark beetle. And thus your ecosystem is not very resilient. You have less diversity. And you can even find images of old pine forests where it has no understory. It's just a bunch of dead needles on the ground with extremely tall pines. And that's an extremely late stage pine forest. It's probably not going to be there a whole lot longer. When we tend to talk about this concept of like resilient and changes, what we were talking about are events that can happen. Things like a forest fire from a lightning strike, or a flood, or human activity that causes damage to that ecosystem or severs that habitat from itself in some way, like by building a road. When those events occur, that's when we talk about resilience. That's when we see, like, if there's a forest fire, a resilient ecosystem will have plants that are intended to grow after a fire that comes through, which is pretty much all of Indiana's forest systems. Or if we have a flood, that ecosystem is able to absorb the damage from the water, and then grow again. Those are resilient systems. But if you have an entire, say, woods that don't have fire germinated seeds, and a fire goes through, you've now lost your woods. It's gone. This is why biodiversity is important. This is why invasive species have such a negative impact. Because if all we have is a massive briar of multiflora rose, it's not going to do anything good for having more and different species. We're going to lose out things we want, birds that we love, plants that we find aesthetically pleasing, and say a disease hits that multiflora rose, it's just going to die. It won't have anything to prevent it. Now, this actually makes for a really, really good example here. What you're looking at is an infestation of European dune grass. And I believe this image was taken somewhere around 1990. And I apologize for the quality of the image. I've been trying to find a better version of this for a long time now. But what you could see here, and I'll try to describe it as best I can, is that dune grass essentially is covering everything. That's all that's growing right now. So what happened is people who managed this particular area decided to remove the dune grass. And it makes for a great experiment because now we get to see what happens if you remove that monoculture to try to bring back the diversity. And what we see is this. Same location, several years later. Instead of having all the dune grass, we now have multiple species of flowers. I think I can see some legumes growing in the dunes. That is an extremely diverse ecosystem in an area that is fairly arid and has high drainage. So that's a really, really good thing to see. That is what we want. And this is the benefit that we derive when we get rid of these invasive species. So in terms of what's going to be a little closer to home, you take out the Asian bush honeysuckle and all of a sudden your forest understory comes back, or all of a sudden your yard gets more visitors because you can plant something different that won't get choked out by a giant bush. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. How do these get here? How do we keep bringing these things in? This picture actually makes a great example of it. Those of you who don't know, this is English ivy. This is one of the most popular ornamental ivies that was ever planted, and it is also my personal nightmare. When I bought my home, the person who had the home before us, she loved English ivy as a decorative ornamental, but unfortunately, she was not aware that it will vine over everything that it can possibly get into. It will even try to vine underneath the siding on your home, and I've been pulling that out of the siding of my own home for some time now. And it is an ongoing fight. This was planted intentionally. Someone wanted it because it looks pretty, but unfortunately it's just incredibly damaging and it doesn't help anything. They get here because we bring them here. We introduce them accidentally, for example, say like with spotted lanternfly or emerald ash borer, or we introduce them intentionally because we think they're great. We intentionally brought Asian bush honeysuckle here. We intentionally brought multiflora rose here. Some of them were ornamentals. Some of them were brought in as a means to prevent erosion or to beautify America's highway system. And unfortunately, the people who brought them here did not take into account what would happen if you brought in a species that doesn't belong here. And unfortunately, you can actually go to stores, to garden supply providers, all kinds of things, and you will find some invasive plants still on sale. Indiana does have the terrestrial plant rule that contains about 44 to 45 different plants, but unfortunately, it does not contain several offenders that we really need to get rid of. This is one example, and this one is, the state has a lot of pressure on it to add it. Winged burning bush. People love to plant winged burning bush. And they think, well, it's just in my yard, I planted it. Well, yes, but if you go out to the woods next to your house, you'll find winged burning bush taking over the understory. We also have winter creeper. That's another one that people will love to put in because, again, it's another pretty vine, but it is very bad. And of course, I mentioned this before with Callery and Bradford pear. We planted these intentionally. There is a Callery pear about 50 feet from my front window. And there are several dotting the street I live on, even though they're such a nasty invasive, and they smell like fish, and people still love them. So we need to watch what we purchase. So that way we don't get another example of Asian bush honeysuckle, because it is really a nightmare. It spreads far beyond what we intend to have it go into, and we don't control it very well. And I'm seeing someone just added, Ronald just added in the chat that Ohio just outlawed winged burning bush. That's a good thing. That's great to hear. I hope we do the same. And if you're concerned about something, you wonder how it travels from your yard, remember, these are subject to the same rules that all plants are. Birds visit them. They can get spread through birds using the seeds, animals brushing against them, pollination occurs. Oh, Callery pear in Ohio, thank you. And these things will outcompete stuff in your own yard. They will fight against the plants that you put in. So you're just saving yourself a headache by monitoring what you purchase and avoiding the invaders. So what I want to do before we dive into the actual meat of Asian bush honeysuckle, what I want to do is I want to encourage everyone here to make a plan to try to combat invasives on your own property. And I will warn you right now, fighting an invasive plant is labor intensive and it is time intensive, and you will not finish it in a single season. It will be a several year process, unfortunately, but we need to do it. First off, what I do is I like to use this chart to kind of show off. This is something that was put out by the Nature Conservancy, a great organization, and a lot of you should definitely visit their websites and see the material they have. So what we want to do is establish conservation targets and goals. We're saying this is what I call success. We want to identify all the species there. And for those of you who are master gardeners, you heard this when you learned about integrated pest management. We're identifying the organisms that are a problem, and we're prioritizing their removal and checking on what plants or animals are beneficial, so that way we don't remove those. We're going to assess control techniques. Basically, we're going to take that information. We're going to understand the organism we want to get rid of. We want to know its ecology and its biology, so that way we can use the proper control technique to remove them. And then based on that, we develop the management plan. What you're going to do is you're going to do cultural changes to remove it, i.e. like maybe planting something that a pest isn't going to get to, or trying to, over time, physically remove plants, or doing something like a cut stump treatment or anything along those lines. And then you're going to monitor how successful that effort was. That way you know, did this work and how far did it go? And then you're going to go back, you're going to look over that information, you're going to decide, okay, this worked, or maybe I need to change something. And in case you're worried about it, I am going to put all this up on YouTube. People on YouTube are watching it right now. Please feel free to review it again. All right, so some of the targets and goals that we might talk about with this situation. Are you planning for aesthetics? Are you trying to plan for conservation? Or do you want something totally eradicated? because in some situations, you may not be able to completely eradicate an invader off of your property or out of an area. If I use multiflora rose as an example, that is like a solid wall of brambles. One person would struggle for quite some time to remove a nasty multiflora rose infestation. You're going to have to plan realistically. Is there a particular plant or set of plants that you want to eliminate or maintain? That is a decision that you need to make. Basically, you want to prioritize the tree of heaven that's growing into your foundation over the little honeysuckle that's growing in the corner. You want to make sure that you're spending your energy effectively. And then, of course, none of these invaders do well when there's a good diversity in the area, because there are some things that are learning to eat them, to attack them, and some things that will fight against the competition. It's just not there yet. But as long as we continue to enhance that local diversity, we plant different things, we encourage different animals, we will help that fight keep going. Now, the most important part to me is identifying the plants that we want to eliminate. The good news is that all of you know someone who can help you identify them. You got emails from me, I can help you. You also have extension educators in every county in Indiana. And if you're from one of the other states, every state in the country does have a land-grant university that most likely has an extension service with it. And I can help you get in contact with them if you need help. Prioritize. Dandelions aren't a threat. Honeysuckle in the corner is. It's pretty simple. And then you want to make sure, like I said before, you want to make sure you identify the ones that are invasive, but you also want to make sure you understand the difference between something that is introduced as compared to invasive. For example, Japanese maple is an introduced plant, but it doesn't damage the Indiana environment in any way. It's actually kind of difficult to make survive in Indiana. It's a pretty ornamental tree. It doesn't harm anything. You want to make sure you're prioritizing based on that. Keep that in mind. Now, just in the interest of time, a little gloss over this a touch. So you want to prioritize site-based prioritization. Where do I go first, as versus species-based? Which do I go after first? If you're trying to clear an area, then you need to establish that area as something that is doable. You don't want to say, I'm going to clear out 10 acres when you only have so much equipment. Or if you're working with species, you need to identify the species that you can actually manage. And if you can't, you need to figure out where you can get help with it. I would encourage everybody to contact your local SISMA. That is county level organizations that are put together by SICM. This may be a combination of both for you, but you just have to set realistic goals for yourself. Now with site-based prioritization, you're going to map out the areas that are invaded versus untouched, and you're going to create blocks of untouched areas that you're keeping clear of invaders. You want to defragment the boundaries of those invaded areas. Basically, you're establishing a whole habitat area. And when you do this, you want to have a reseeding plan. So say you take out half an acre of honeysuckle, you don't want to leave it bare. You've got to get stuff in the ground, or else the honeysuckle is just going to grow right back. When it's species-based, what's nearby but not yet in sight of interest? This means that you've got a nice, lovely area, but if you see honeysuckle approaching from the woods and it gets closer year after year, you need to act on that. You also need to figure out what is in that area. Is there stuff you want to keep? And are the invaders going to expand beyond their boundary? And then you want to make sure that you use tools to help you assess that area. Sometimes this could be a drone. Sometimes this could just be some windshield surveys, any number of things to help you figure out what is going on in your area of interest. Okay, so getting to the meat of this, the reason for that I put so much ahead there defining things is because Asian bush honeysuckle, the good thing is it's actually pretty easy to identify, and its management is actually fairly well understood. And I wanted to make sure I got you guys some extra information on how to plan for eliminating this plant, because it is just so tough. So in terms of identification, Asian bush honeysuckle has dark egg-shaped leaves with white tubular flowers, or little trumpets. We're going to see those appear really soon. The leafing out is already occurring. Like I was saying earlier, if it's in your forest understory right now and it is green, it is either Asian bush honeysuckle or it is multiflora rose. Telling the difference between those two is fairly simple. Multiflora rose, the leaves will look like rose leaves. With Asian bush honeysuckle, though, we can use this image as an example. You could see those nice, dark, egg-shaped leaves with little white trumpet-like flowers. Now, it is primarily in the understory of forests and on the edges of woodlots, which is why here in Terre Haute, we see it a lot because we are a tree city, but it also tends to like to take over corners and the sides of fence lots, especially say if you have neighbors who don't necessarily manage it on their property. Well, it can invade yours in those areas. They are what we call an edge species. They're able to survive on the edge of a habitat. Not a lot of species can do that. And as I've been hinting at, they're the first to leaf out, but they are also the last to decline. This means that we can do a few different management techniques based on that information. And a lot of the times when you are treating for a honeysuckle, it's actually going to be much later in the year. The other nasty thing about honeysuckle is that it will release a chemical into the soil that will inhibit competition. So they're kind of like walnuts in that they will put something into the soil that'll prevent other plants from going near them. Now, in terms of control, you have a couple of options, and unfortunately, they're all pretty labor intensive. I strongly recommend that you get some kind of mechanical aid to help remove this, especially if you have a larger plant. Honeysuckle can get wide and it can get tall, and its roots are very strong. Don't mess around with this plant. Pulling by hand will work if the plants are young, but I mean, they got to be real young. They cannot be very many feet up at all if you want to have any chance of pulling it by hand. And even then, I am very doubtful that you could do it if it were even that high, if it were, say, a foot off the ground. Using a skid steer or a tractor might be your best option for a really dense infestation, or if you have a very large plant that you're fighting. Some of the infestations can get so dense that getting through the plants may quite literally be physically impossible. So you're going to need that heavier equipment to help chew away at the edge of the infestation as you begin to divide and conquer. Now, in terms of chemical control, there are some options. Now, when you are doing chemical control, you are going to look at different ways of applying things. Starting with foliar application, you only want to do this when plants are in easy reach. You're only going to spray chemicals to wet the foliage. You don't want to soak because that means that you might be hitting things that you don't want to kill. The best time to apply a foliar application, if you are using something like glyphosate or another chemical, is that you want to apply in late fall while the plants are still green. Because if it's late fall, that means that every other plant around it is going dormant, but the honeysuckle is still active, it's still doing uptake. You'll be able to kill the honeysuckle or at least damage it without doing damage to the plants surrounding it. Now, this comes out of a paper. You have to forgive me, I can't remember. I believe it is a Purdue publication that I got this out of. This describes the different chemicals that are going to be useful when you're combating this. Glyphosate is a perennial favorite. You can get that under all kinds of different brand names. The one we know the best is Roundup, though there are several more. 2,4-D and triclopyr together under a brand name called Crossbow is also effective, as is triclopyr itself. And you'll know that one is Garlon, is a pretty common one, or Tahoe if you use that. And again, for those of you watching on YouTube or people who are wanting to be able to take notes on this, just remember to pause it here, write down what you need. Now, a cut stump application. This is where you are actually cutting a portion of the plant off, and then you are painting or spraying an herbicide on the exposed stump close to the ground. I was actually doing this earlier today on some other nasty plants that I've been fighting because those plants are starting to come active. You can use a water or oil soluble herbicide, but there is a difference between the two of them when you're applying them. So water soluble herbicides must be applied to the stump within minutes of cutting, because if you wait too long, the plant will begin to seal off the damage you just did to it to protect itself, and the water soluble herbicide will not go into the plant. Oil soluble herbicides can be applied post-cutting with a larger time interval because the oil will seep down better. The water, however, will have evaporated by the time it could seep down far enough if the plant's already started to seal itself off. There is a concern for runoff when using an oil-soluble herbicide, though I would argue that this is also a concern with water as well. So you need to be really careful as you apply this stuff to make sure you're doing it responsibly, because you don't want to hit anything near that. You don't want to expose Let's see, and I see a question, is painting best in the autumn or winter? That is probably going to be in the autumn, but I believe I have a chart coming up that actually explains that. So give me just a moment longer. So the herbicides that are recommended for cut stump treatments, glyphosate and 2,4-D-triclopyr, again, we saw those with foliar applications. We also add to this one 2,4-D with picloram, and that's going to be under brand names. Tordon is probably the most famous one for that one. And then Pathway as well. And of course, triclopyr with Carlon. I know a lot of folks who will use Tordon, but honestly, a lot of these are very effective. It just depends on what's going to work the best for you. Again, we also need to keep in mind that the more that we put chemicals on these plants, the more the plant will eventually develop resistance. So please keep that in mind as you're working with populations of these things, year after year, I should say. And then there's also basal spraying. We have another question there. I've heard that Tordon will travel and could damage wanted plants. That is going to be down to how you apply it. Make sure you're following the label directions. I've not heard any studies yet indicate that Tordon is persistent in the ground after its application, after its residual is supposed to be completed. But I think that a lot of those problems could be alleviated so long as people are properly following the label directions. So please make sure you're doing that. And then if you are seeing problems come after that, you might want to consider contacting the state chemist to make sure you're reporting that this is an issue. Now with basal spraying, this is spraying an herbicide with an oil-based carrier on the lower 12 to 18 inches of the plant stem. With honeysuckle, that can sometimes be really challenging because you may not be able to access that stem. This is done often in conjunction with girdling the plant and then applying the chemical. And this is going to be best done during the dormant season, so that way you're not fighting quite as much with healthy green stick plants, so on and so forth. And then again, we're looking at chemicals that are worked for basal spraying, and we're seeing pretty much the same things we were seeing before. The only addition this time is Garlon 4 or Stalker, which has the active ingredients of triclopyr and imazapyr. All right, so we have that question about application timing. This is a piece of information that Sikkim put out that I think is just one of the absolute best things you can get your hands on. And you can find this on their website, which I believe, and I'll put it in the chat right now, is sikkim.info. And I will add that to the comments on the video. So this is a great chart. It gives you the timing for treating all kinds of different plants, everything from autumn olive to kudzu, so on and so forth. It tells you the exact months to do it and which type of treatment that you want to do there. Also, the kinds of things you want to apply. And I guarantee you that just about every extension educator in Indiana has a copy of it sitting in their office or knows where to get it real quick. Now, if we are focusing on our plant of concern, though, we're looking at this top row up here that contains autumn olive, Asian bush honeysuckle, obviously Japanese barberry, etc. So if we're looking at that cut surface treatment, like Patty was asking earlier, that one can be done from June all the way through March. So that's got a very wide range of application timing that it can be done in. I would, however, still kind of look at that fall timing, because if you're treating those big, strong, healthy plants that you're seeing in the middle of the summer, I'm not sure that's going to be the best time to burn your own energy on doing it. I myself would kind of prefer to work towards that fall, maybe getting close to winter kind of schedule, because I think it would just be easier to work with there. And then let's look at the different ones that we can work with though. So foliar spray, obviously we're looking for when the leaves come out. I like thinking about doing this one earlier because the leaves are going to be a little younger, a little weaker. So they'll also probably be a little bit better for the uptake of those before they develop a lot of their stronger structure as time goes on. I would lean either earlier or consider later as time goes on, because then the leaves will weaken up a little bit as they prepare for abscission for leaf fall during the fall. And then I already pointed out the cut surface treatment. You can go from June to March, but again, I feel like aiming for that fall timing may work out the best for it. But honestly, if Sikkim says at this time, then most likely they have a massive amount of experience and they're probably right. And then the basal bark treatments, you're looking at timing here is essentially fall through winter is going to be your best timing on that one. But like that note is saying, this can be really challenging on multi-stem shrubs. because if you're trying, these plants can be really strong, they can be really intertangled, and if they have lots of stems, getting down to the single stem coming out of the ground can be really, really challenging. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about doing a basal bark treatment. Now, this one I left in here. This one has some research going into it right now. I know Purdue's been doing some prescribed burning work. Fire adapted communities may experience some good control with a prescribed burn. But folks, I want you to understand very, very clear here. Do not attempt to do a prescribed burn on your own. This requires a license, and it requires help from other people who are also licensed, because if this gets out of control, I don't even want to think of what could happen. Feel free to talk to your extension educators about this one, or maybe even consider contacting nursery inspectors with DNR. I think this has good potential, and I think it's something we need to consider because Indiana's hardwood systems are fire adapted. But again, there's some research still going into this. Something else to consider too is that reseeding is common. A lot of these plants will have built up a seed bank over time, so burns may need to happen consecutively over several years. And just again, to highlight it again, it does need authorization and training in our state. All right, that is what I had for this evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. I just want to make sure that to highlight the reportinvasive.com. It's our website where you can look at different invasive species. You can also report invasive species by calling 1-866-NO-EXOTIC. This is primarily intended for new invaders that we are keeping our eyes open for, such as spotted lanternfly and other things. Asian jumping worm, please, we need more reporting on that. Please feel free to call if you find them. You can also go to www.edmaps.org or www.glidden.org to report these. I will be happy to help you get those in there. Or if you're not sure, email me. Tell me where you saw it. Send me a picture. Let me know what condition it was in, and I will report it for you. And you all should have my email, and it's right there on the screen right now. All right, with that, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight.